Welcome back to educator.com. Today's lecture, we're going to go over inflation. So let's dig right into this material here. All right, in today's lesson overview, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce the concept of inflation. So what exactly is inflation? Why is it bad, or is it bad at all? We're going to discuss the different costs imposed by inflation. We're going to identify winners and losers from inflation. And yes, you can actually win from inflation, so it is definitely possible. We're going to distinguish between the nominal and real inflation rate, or nominal and real interest rate, which is defined from inflation. We're going to differentiate between the wage price spiral and the monetarist views of inflation. We're going to examine the most commonly used price indices, which include the CPI and the PPI. And then finally, we're going to explain why the GDP deflator serves to measure the increase in the aggregate price level. So we're going to see why the GDP deflator could be used as a measure of indicating the rate of inflation here. So let's go ahead and get started right here. So what is exactly inflation? Well, it's really the general increase in prices, or to be more precise, it's really not that the prices are going up per se. It's that the purchasing power of your money decreases. So if you take a dollar and what it used to buy in 1930 versus a dollar and what it can buy in 2014, there's going to be a huge discrepancy. And really the reason for that discrepancy, a lot of it has to do with the decreasing purchasing power of your money. And that's what inflation is really about. Now, it's not when you're talking about just when only one particular product's price increases, but when all prices increases. So when we're talking about inflation, we're not saying, oh, the price of housing has gone up or the price of baseball games has gone up. It's a uniform across the board increase of all the goods and services that individuals consume. Now, inflation, obviously, again, it's a problem. And particularly in the late 1970s, the Federal Reserve Chairman at the time, Paul Volcker, he made taming inflation his top priority. Today's Fed, which is led by Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and now Janet Yellen, inflation really hasn't been the top priority, primarily because if you use CPI and PPI as a gauge, inflation hasn't been a real issue. But back in the 70s, inflation was, you're dealing with double-digit inflation. And so the Fed chairman made it a point to try to use contractionary monetary policy. And so by doing so, by increasing interest rates, the Fed was able to tame inflation, but in the process essentially created a recession. So again, this is one of the trade-offs that you find in macro, that when you have, at least in the short run, when you have high levels of inflation, you might have low unemployment, and that's a good thing. But if you have low inflation, if you have low inflation, you have high levels of employment. But when you have high inflation, then you may have low unemployment, but then you're stuck with higher prices, right? So in the short run, there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So again, what's wrong? What's exactly wrong with inflation, and what are some of the costs associated with inflation? So that's kind of the focus of what we're going to look at today. So what are some costs of inflation? I mean, literal things that make life difficult for people living in an economy where there's inflation. Well, the first thing is that there's shoe leather costs. So there are increased costs of transactions due to inflation, literally the wear and tear of it all. Okay. So since people avoid holding onto money during periods of inflation, because if you hold on to money, then money doesn't act as a proper store of value, people basically waste time and energy making transactions to avoid sitting on cash. So as a result, you get inefficiencies, and you can argue that the banking sector increases. People find ways of trying to manipulate the money process. So the opportunity cost is that instead of doing real and productive work, I'm not saying banking isn't, but there's really an excess amount of human capital diverted to these things. So these are what's referred to as these shoe leather costs. Okay. Another cost of inflation might be the menu costs. I mean, quite literally, there are real costs of changing listed prices. I mean, if you have if you have hyperinflation, when you're selling a hamburger for $5 and then the next day it's $10, $20, then these menu costs actually keep on changing, and it's really inconvenient. But not only that, they're actually real menu costs. You actually change the what's being listed constantly. Now, again, in hyperinflation, countries will avoid changing prices. Okay. And again, they try to avoid this at all costs here. In Zimbabwe, the inflation rate in just May of 2008, the inflation rate reached 1.694 million%. Can you imagine that? You hold $1,700,000, you hold on to it for a year, it only has $1 worth of purchasing power. So again, that's an extreme case of inflation, but it does happen, and it has happened. Unit of account costs. Again, with inflation, now money, you don't use it as a reliable gauge of what's going on here. So the problem with inflation is that money becomes really a less reliable unit of measurement. Profit due to inflation is still taxed, and therefore investment is discouraged, right? So the IRS, they don't really care about inflation. They just look at the absolute gains. And so you have a problem when you have this it's an imperfect way of seeing these things. So in periods of high inflation, you get a lot of costs associated with that. So for those of you guys that took U.S. history, and particularly maybe AP U.S. history, you can actually look at U.S. history in terms of inflation. In the turn of the 20th century, when there's a struggle for political power, one of the candidates for president, William Jennings Bryan, his argument was really for inflation, whereas the Republicans led by William Howard Taft, they wanted, or William McKinley, they actually wanted a hard currency. They wanted gold-backed currency, whereas the Democrats wanted more of a silver-backed or a loose currency, an easier currency. They really were trying to figure out which constituencies they wanted to protect. William Jennings Bryan, his famous speech as depicted here was, "Do not crucify mankind on a cross of gold," which was a case of, let inflation happen, because it primarily helped out farmers. Farmers were debtors. They had tons of debts. And so with inflated currency, they were paying back their loans, and it was worth less. And so this is a case where inflation actually helps out, those that have a lot of debt. So farmers back then, and possibly even today, they incur a lot of debt. They take out fixed rate loans. And so if there's an increase in inflation, then they're paying back the loan at a lower real cost when it actually occurs. So this is kind of tying economics to the U.S. history curriculum. Again, so as I mentioned, there are winners and there are losers from inflation. The nominal interest, again, we think in nominal terms. When you pay $20 for food, you don't say, I'm paying $18 in real money from 2012. Okay, we think in nominal terms. You get $20, you get $20. But I think we also operate with an implicit understanding that $20 really doesn't buy what $20 bought 5 years ago. So the nominal interest rate is literally the actual interest that is paid on the loan. But again, the equation here that's going to come in handy. It was on both the 2013 and 2012 FRQ. If you go to those FRQs that I'll work out, it's important to know what is the equation, what's the relationship between the real and nominal. And so the real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus the expected inflation rate. So real equals nominal minus the expected inflation. So really simple example here. If the nominal equals 12% and inflation equals 3%, then what's the real? Well, 12 minus 3 equals 9% real interest rate. So very simple equation, but again, it's really not the math that's really the focus, but what is nominal and what is real here. Now, borrowers, they win with inflation because they pay back in nominal dollars. So the real amount that they pay back is in less because of the inflation, because you pay back in nominal terms. And savers and lenders, they lose because the amount of money that they receive is not worthless, but it's worth less than when they actually borrowed it, right? So again, now obviously, if you say, well, if there's inflation, I don't want to save. Well, $1 million in inflationary times is much better than $0 saved, right? So they relatively lose savers, but obviously, saving is definitely better than not saving at all. Now, it's just to give you kind of an idea. In the United States, the 30-year mortgage actually really represents a triumph of low inflationary expectations. Many Americans probably have a 30-year mortgage. While it may be frustrating that, the first couple of years of the mortgage, they're only paying off the interest, the fact that the United States offers that actually, again, it's an idea that in the country, in the United States, one can expect, reasonably that the interest rates are going to be low. Chances are in Zimbabwe there are no 30-year mortgages, simply because of the history of inflation in that country. So again, countries with uncertain levels of inflation, they're not going to issue long-term loans because it really doesn't make sense, because if you can't anticipate the inflation, then it's just too risky on the lender to offer a 30-year loan. All right, so here's some real interest rate examples. Very, very simple, just to get the concept down here. So if the nominal interest rate is 12% and the expected inflation rate is 5%, what's the real interest rate? Okay, real equals the nominal minus inflation. Okay, so you're just filling it in here. 12% minus 5% equals 7%. So the real interest rate is 7%. Okay, if the nominal interest rate is 20%, so again, let's put real equals nominal minus inflation. If the nominal interest rate is 20%, is it possible for the real interest rate to be negative? And the answer is probably not, but is it possible? Is there a chance that the real interest rate, with such a high nominal interest rate, is it possible the real interest rate could be negative? And the answer is absolutely. Okay, let's create a scenario. Let's say you have negative 5% real interest rate. That just means that the inflation rate is 25% here. So if inflation is greater than the nominal, okay, then the real interest rate is negative. Okay, so again, this is a possibility. Probably not going to happen, but definitely is a possibility here. Okay, L. Ellington takes out a mortgage from her bank at a fixed 3.5 nominal interest rate. Over the years, the inflation rate unexpectedly decreases to 1.5%. Who wins? Who loses? And explain. Okay, and the answer is, okay, 3.5%. Okay, so let's assume that she keeps the loan, no refinancing. So the borrower is at 3.5%, and that's nominal. And let's say inflation rate unexpectedly decreases to 1.5. So let's say it was 3% before, and inflation decreases. Okay, so who wins? Okay, the winner is actually the lender wins. Okay, so the interest rate was maybe predicated on a higher interest rate. So if the inflation rate is predicated on a higher inflation rate, so if the lender gets a lower interest rate, then or if inflation decreases as a result, the lender wins, and so the borrower, or Ellie Ellington, borrower, loses. Why? She's paying back money, and it's actually worth more relative to when she originally got the loan. So again, nominal versus real, it's important to know and be able to distinguish when one benefits from inflation and when one is hurt from inflation. Okay, so what is this wage price spiral here? So it's this combination of a cost push and demand pull inflation that leads to this wage price spiral. When there's too much money chasing too few goods, the price of products will tend to increase, which leads to demand pull inflation. Again, let's say there's $100 in the economy and there's two goods here. well, the scarcity of goods, people want that good, so it's going to drive up the price, given that there's this is a huge demand. So it's the idea that it's the demand that pulls up inflation. And the other way of looking at it is the cost push angle to this. And so when workers demand higher wages, well, as a result of inflated prices, prices of products consequently go up as well, leading to this wage price spiral. So not only do the prices go up, the price of the goods that you want go up, well, in order to keep the workers happy, then employers are going to have to raise their wages. Well, if they raise their wages, they're going to raise the price of their products. Well, if they raise the price of their products, workers are going to want to be able to buy stuff, so they're going to demand higher wages. And it's this cost push and demand pull inflation effect that leads to this wage price spiral. Again, it's the increased price of product that leads to higher wages, which leads to increased price of products, which leads to higher wages, and so on. I mean, we could go on and on about this effect, but that's basically the net impact of what's going on. Keynesians, they tend to favor this model of how inflation works, and that the prices are sticky, downward inflexible here. So Keynesians, they tend to favor that, okay, well, inflation works because of the money that's available, and that the prices, they don't adjust downwards. They kind of go up as a result of psychological impulses, so to speak. But they don't believe, Keynesians, they don't necessarily believe that prices are going to adjust downwards, that they're sticky. So whereas a classical economist might say, well, in the long run, prices go down, Keynesian will emphasize the fact that, yeah, they may go up, but very rarely will wages actually go down. So again, you take a look at this monetarist view of inflation here. So the monetarist view of inflation is the following here. Milton Friedman, he viewed that inflation is simply an issue of money supply. So money supply is that inflation occurs not because that prices go up, but that when there's more money that is input into the economy, that's what causes inflation here. So this quantity theory of the money is very quite simple. An increase in the supply of money will correspondingly increase inflation. So I think a lot of people would generally agree with this, that it's the money supply that is the primary driver of inflation. And so that's kind of a commonsensical approach to what inflation is. Now, the Austrian view argues that using the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, to measure inflation is inaccurate because inflation is unevenly spread through different goods and services. So this is a legitimate argument to say that, oh, inflation is the general rise in prices. Well, the argument from the Austrian viewpoint, Friedrich Hayek would say that, well, inflation is unevenly distributed. Housing could be affected a lot more so than food. So it's hard to really say that inflation is a general rise in all prices, because people don't buy general things, they buy specific things. And so that's kind of the idea that Austrian economists would argue that inflation is improperly measured by the CPI. It's really understated. Well, Paul Krugman would criticize that, and again, he's a Nobel Prize-winning Keynesian economist. He rejects this Austrian view of inflation, and his argument is stating that the monetary base tripled in 2011, and yet there was no widespread inflation. So he would argue that, okay, prices, are sticky, and so they're adjusting upwards, and it's not necessarily the case that inflation is going to, increase proportionately with the increase in the money supply. Now, again, time will only tell which of the two camps has been more correct about how the economy should have been handled, whether it's the Keynesians or whether it's the Austrian economists. So measurement and calculation of inflation. So what's going on here? So the aggregate price level, that's the measure of the overall prices in the economy. So that measures the inflation rate here. What is a market basket? A market basket is this hypothetical set of consumer purchases of goods and services. So all the stuff that an average urban consumer consumes over a period of time. And a price index really it just measures the cost of purchasing a given market basket and in any given year. And the index value is set to 100 in the base year. So whether it's a consumer price index, producer price index, at 100, that's kind of the value at the base year. So if you take a look at it, the price index is the cost of the market basket in a given year divided by the cost of the market basket in the base year, and then you multiply that by $100. So let's say the base is 2010 here, and in 2011, let's say, the cost was $105, and in 2000, or let's say it was $100, and in 2011, let's say it's $105. Well, this is really simple here. 105 divided by 100 equals 1.05 times 100, and you have the price index in 2011 is 105. In 2010, it's 100. Okay, so you have 5% increase in price as a result. And so the inflation rate is exactly, it's pretty much the next logical step. You take the price index in year 2, which in this case is 105, minus the price index in year 1, which is 100. And so you have 5 divided by the price index in year 1, which is 100, which is 0.05 times 100. And so you have inflation rate of 5%. So that's how you calculate the price index, and how do you find the inflation rate from the price index. The consumer price index and the PPI. So what are these two price indices? Well, the consumer price index, this is the most common. So this is the most common. This is a popular used tool to measure inflation. It's a market basket of a typical urban American family. Now, don't ask me, what this typical urban family actually is. It's hard to generalize exactly what a typical urban family. Chances are no two families are going to buy the same basket of goods. But again, this is something that the government kind of creates as a measure here. What is the typical purchase of an average family here? And the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is what they report. So the BLS, they send employees out to survey prices on a multitude of items in food, apparel, recreation, medical care, transportation, and other categories. And what they do with this data is, again, they try to figure out what this average American consumes here. Now, here's the thing, some problems with CPI, among other things. CPI tends to overstate inflation because of substitution bias and technological advances. I think for obvious reasons, a market basket in 1950 is going to look a lot different than in 2000, and even 2000 and 2010. Where would you fit an iPad? In terms of a market basket. And not only that, substitution bias. Let's say the price of oranges go up by 50%. And if you have oranges in your fixed basket, it's going to seem like inflation has skyrocketed. Maybe not 50%, but that 50% increase in the price of oranges is a pretty big hit. But the reality is that, if oranges go up by 50%, consumers might just switch to strawberries, which, who knows, the price could have decreased. So if the CPI increases, generally it's an overstatement of the true inflation because of this substitution bias. And you also have the producer price index. And what the PPI does, it measures the cost of typical basket of goods and services that producers purchase. So the people that make stuff in the economy. And usually this tends to be used as this early warning signal of changes in the inflation rate. So the PPI and the CPI, they generally will go in the same direction, but the PPI is more of this inflation warning signal about whether or not maybe the Federal Reserve has to respond or the government does. So the GDP deflator is defined by this equation here, is you take the nominal GDP over the real GDP, and you multiply by 100. The advantage in using this is that you're not using a fixed market basket. The market basket is actually changing depending on what Americans buy. So it's not exactly a price index, but again, it serves to show how much the aggregate price level has increased or possibly decreased, right? So unlike the CPI, GDP is not based on a fixed basket of goods and services. Again, it's allowed to change with people's consumption and investment patterns. And again, for that reason, it solves some problems, and that's why some people prefer this GDP deflator rather than using the CPI. The default basket in each year is the set of all goods that were produced in the country in that particular year. But again, the reality is that the CPI, you have the CPI, you have the PPI, the GDP deflator. They tend to move generally, again, in the same direction, in the same percentages. They generally is not going to be like CPI goes up 10% and PPI drops 20%. You're going to see a lot of similar movements, and that makes sense. Okay. Now here's some price index problems here. So let's work this out to close this particular lecture. So if the CPI market basket increases from 100 in year 1 to 105 in year 2, what is the CPI in year 2? What is the consumer price index here? So let's take a look here. So if the CPI, if the index is going to be, if the base year in year 1, so year 1 is the base, okay, it's going to be 100. Okay, so the inflation rate here is 105 minus 100 over 100. So there's an inflation rate of 5% basically. So in year 2, which is year 1 is 100 because that's the base index here. Then in year 2, the market basket is going to be 105. So that's the correct answer here. Okay, if the CPI increases from 120 in 2014 to 160, what is the inflation rate here? Well, again, you take this index in year 2 is 160 minus what was in year 1, 120, all over 120 here, and then you get 40 over 120 equals 1 over 3. Okay, 1 over 3 times 100, and you get an inflation rate that's pretty high, 33%. So that's pretty high for an inflation number here. And then real GDP deflator here, finally here. So GDP deflator, the formula here equals the nominal over the real. Actually, hold on a second. The real over the nominal. GDP deflator equals the nominal over the real times 100. So if the GDP deflator is 150 and the real GDP is 1 million, then what is the nominal GDP? Let's say the value is X here times 100. Well, you multiply this out here, and X, the nominal GDP, equals 1.5 million as a result. So again, it's very simple math problems. Just be able to understand, what the equations are, how do you find the inflation rate, and what's the formula for the GDP deflator. You have the nominal over real times 100. Thank you for watching educator.com.